also help representing them in different situations that they have. And it's been a great project and one that Sarah has been a guiding force on. William Boyd, who's in the back room, what a great addition he's been to our faculty. And William works domestically, yes, but he does a large amount of international work, and we all know how important it is to prevent deforestation as one way of getting at climate change. And William has set up an organization, and I'm going to say a few words about it, but what it is 1,000 times more than what I'm saying. It is really working, and he's been a key person in it, and it's an organization of states, meaning states with a small s, not at the international meaning, within the United States, and there are several, and then states from foreign countries, provinces, and subdivisions of nations. And they have put together a deforestation program that really is already very effective, but is gaining strength all the time. And then Mark Squillace, who does a large amount of public lands work, and his example has sure meant a lot to me. And Mark is just busy on a whole number of different kinds of projects, but one thing he did that was interesting was he went back to DC when Bruce Babbitt was Secretary of the Interior, and spent 2 years or 1 year back with them. And boy, they did instrumental work on the Endangered Species Act and setting up programs at a time when there was real pressure to amend the act, and the idea was to have programs established administratively that resolve the problems raised by the people who wanted to do the amendments, and it's been of lasting benefit. So I just wanted to mention that. And David Getchus's name has come up a lot, and I'm going to guess that certainly many, maybe almost all of you at least know of David's name, and many know of how central David was to improving the American West. And you talk about public service. He founded the Native American Rights Fund. John Echohawk, the director, is here today. And David was the founding director of that wonderful organization, and spent 3 years as Dick Lamb's Director of Natural Resources with a staff of some 1,200 people, and worked on all kinds of water issues, and it was a time of great progress during the Lamb administration. But David's work just went on and on and on, and we miss him for we miss him for 3 reasons. One is we loved him, and a second was that we thought of his body of work so often and how important it was. And third, we just missed the contributions. It's been a big hole for us. We have a very strong faculty in this field, one of the strongest in the country, but losing David was very difficult, and we see that on a day-to-day basis. Add to that David was dean of this law school for 7 years, and he, more than any other person by far, is responsible for this building. And David was one of these people, and I've run into maybe 5 or 6 of them, who can handle all the broad conceptual issues, missions, future development, concepts, and also just on the ground individual specific problems. And I think David knew where every nail and 2x4 and piece of concrete that went into this building is. He was, and I know because I worked with him on this, but boy, I was just in his dust because he was really something. And one of the really great awards in honors in the whole conservation movement is the Bob Marshall Award. And you've heard his name several times already because he was one of the people who set up administrative wilderness. And the Wilderness Society has the Bob Marshall Award. It's the highest award of the Wilderness Society, and David received the Bob Marshall Award, which certainly was fitting. So I just wanted to pass on those things. Today, as we all know, there are problems with wilderness. And there are problems of management and maintenance, and we see them right up here above us on the Front Range and Indian Peaks, but we see them across the country. And there's the failure to designate wilderness. There are bills pending that should pass, and they haven't. But it's okay to have occasions that you set aside for pure celebration. And you're kind of allowed to imagine there aren't the problems. And we do it very early in January every year. We do it in late May. We do it in early September. We do it in late November and late December. And so that's the spirit we're proceeding in here today, is to just have an honest celebration and just take that luxury, really, to wish away, pretend away problems for a couple of days and exult in wilderness, which really is one of America's greatest contribution to the world of ideas and reality. Today, we're going to keep the introductions very brief. We will have 2 poems from our favorite judge. We'll have several readings from some of the best voices for wilderness that you will know a fair number of these words, but I think there'll probably be some that you didn't know. And some of these voices were heard in the formative years, but more often they came forth in terms of crisis of wilderness. Aldo Leopold and Arthur Carhart and Bob Marshall set up a jewel of an administrative system for wilderness. But way too early, in the mid-30s, the Forest Service lost its bearings and started to chop away at it and split up different of those administrative wilderness areas. And among other things, that led to the founding of the Wilderness Act in 1935, and continuing and increasing eloquent entreaties to make wilderness protection permanent. And when the bill was introduced, as our young friends have explained, it looked like a long shot. Wayne Aspinall, as they mentioned from this state, was chair of the Interior Committee back in a time when those old-style chairmen really ruled. Stuart Udall used to say, he was on the committee, and he used to say that Chairman Aspinall required them to get a pass if they had to go out during a meeting, a hearing, to go to the bathroom. And Aspinall really did run things. Boy, the pressure just built and built and built, and what has always been the case with wilderness, and you can look at every single wilderness proposal, it was grassroots. And yes, you had organizations and entities, but always you have, we love this area. It's near us. We want it protected. And so finally, 50 years ago, those voices became embedded in solid law. As one wag so joyously put it, we've finally decided to protect forever lands where the hand of man has never set foot. But then, every single addition to the wilderness system has faced fierce opposition. Again, over and over, grassroots supporters prevailed. Witness Connie Harvey, whom we'll hear from later, here in Colorado. In the 60s, Alaska now is a state, and there are big-time proposals to develop Alaska, including the pipeline. And the idea of having wilderness set up in Alaska was a long shot. But step by step, they made progress. And in the 1980 Alaska Land Act, all of it came to fruition, and Congress protected 56 million acres of land, almost the size of the state of Colorado, as wilderness in Alaska. In 95, after the elections of 94, when wilderness opponents took over really all parts of Congress, it seemed, it looked as though Utah could steamroll through a hideous anti-wilderness bill that would have choked off all the rising sentiment that was gathering so quickly and strongly down there. But the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, the Grand Canyon Trust, the Wilderness Society, the Sierra Club, other groups, and their supporters, their members, came forward. I'll return to this a bit later in one of the readings, and brought out the people. And in December of 95, Newt Gingrich, then House leader, concluded that he didn't have enough votes and would not send the bill even to the floor for a vote. And today, wilderness bills are stalled in Congress. This is just one person's view, but while it will take patience, and I'm not thinking of a time period here, we're going to return to the time when Congress loosens up and good bills, including good wilderness bills, can go through once again, and we'll have a steady, sometimes slow, progression of good wilderness bills that do go through. Keep in mind the historical fact that our young friends presented to us. 50 years ago, the expectation of many was that the number of millions of acres of wilderness would be represented by a single digit. 50 years later, we're in triple digits. We've got 12 times as much wilderness as we had then, and I'm telling you, there's going to be more to come. And today, we'll hear from some of the voices, some of the best voices too, and sentiments that will continue to represent the people as we move forward and make a second 50 years of wilderness policy. Several of us, even people of my vintage, have been talking seriously and making pledges to each other that we're going to get together again on 50 years from now. As with Truman and Ben, we wanted to have different kinds of voices represented here, and we were sure that we wanted one of them to be poetry. They only made one Greg Hobbs. First-rate water lawyer, hard-working Colorado Supreme Court justice who's willing to break from tradition and bring good old Western history and color into his opinions, big-hearted public servant, and poet, Greg.
Wilderness. And so the great rivers that arise along the divide and in our wilderness areas, I want to celebrate them first. And Truman and Ben, congratulations on what you're doing in your generation. It's going to take each generation to carry it forward. Colorado, mother of rivers. When I was young, the waters sang of being here before I am, of falling sweet and soft and slow to berry bog and high meadow, and held me in her lap and cooed the willow roots, the gaining pools, and called me through bright dappled grass, and called me, oh, my shining one, and shaped a bed to lay me on, and played the flute so high and clear, and shaped the stones to carry me when I am young and full of fight, for roaring here and roaring there, for pouring torrents in the air. When I am young as mountain snow, in crag and cleft and cracked window, I call the greenback cutthroat trout. I call the nymph and hellgrammite. I call the hatch to catch a wind. I call upon the mountain track. I call the scarlet to the jaw as morning calls her own hatchlings. Call Yampa, wait, the Rio Grande, San Juan, the Platte, the Arkansas.
We feel blessed by our riches of being able to have three of our very finest Western writers as keynoters at this gathering. The first is Rick Bass, who has worked on wildness on two levels as a much decorated author of true conservation classics, such as The 9 Mile Wolves and The Book of Yak, and works on Alaska and Africa. And also giving of his time and energies and working at the local, on-the-ground level as an advocate to protect the wildness in his beloved Yak Valley of northwestern Montana. Rick Bass.
Thanks, Charles. Can y'all hear me in the back? Is my microphone amplifying or you just hear me? It's mic'd? All right. Wow. Oh, it's just hanging down. Wow. Okay. It's so great to be here with new young folks working for Wilderness, I started to say the old legends like, no, it's really great being here. Hey, Doug, again, that does not go with this previous statement. It's just great seeing friends and fellow warriors. It's kind of bad form to come in and talk about the Yak, about a place that has not been designated as wilderness yet. We're here to celebrate what we've got instead of whining and saying this is what we really need. But that's, I can't get before a microphone and not talk about the Yak and ask for help. So that's what I'm here for. I'll be brief. I've been, Doug was there in the Yak, in '64 when they were starting out saying this should be wilderness, and Timber just kept fighting and saying no wilderness in the Yak. You can have wilderness anywhere but the Yak. And historically, it's been a trading chip in any legislation that's gone forward. And so we're playing catch up. We're still playing catch up here 50 years. Not 1 acre of Yak wilderness exists. Folks in this room have fought long and hard for it, and hopefully it won't take another 50 years. Hopefully it'll take another 2 weeks. We've got a bill in the Senate. We've got the great John Tester working on it and standing up for it. But in the meantime, in those last 50 years, there's been this incredible culture of resistance. Even though the timber industry has died, blown away, as we predicted it would if it didn't change, there's a cultural resistance to wilderness in the Yak. And that's me being funny with understatement. I mean, it's been an incredible journey to be an activist up there where they used not to know what environmentalists look like. And there was a real culture of bullying. There were death threats. There were pipe bombs. The forest supervisors would vilify, environmentalists in print by name. There'd be a fire outside your house. The fire department wouldn't come. My dear friend Scott, they set his truck on fire. Just all kinds of naughty things. It was a bad place to be an environmentalist. Now it's a great place. We've outlasted them. We've proven our worth and our trust. We've been advocating for sustainable forestry in the front country, and people have come to realize that we're not just there to lock things up, but to help develop a sustainable community in a place where there's never been one. So it's a good time to be an environmentalist up there, but we still don't have any wilderness. So I'm asking for your help. Don't forget about the Yak. So for 30 years, I've been trying to figure out how to argue and agitate and present the Yak. Why should we have wilderness in the Yak? Why? And I go through all these reasons. We heard some of them last night. We've heard some this morning. We'll hear some later today. And I'm about at my end of my loop. I think I've thought of all the different reasons why there should be Yak wilderness. But I thought of one more this summer. And it's because it smells good. So I'm going to read about that. 1 million acres of low-elevation, dense green forest in a magic seam between the Pacific Northwest fungal rot and the Rocky Mountains' glamorous viewsheds of wildfire and glaciers. The Yak Valley of northwestern Montana, no place else like it on Earth. What does one say to the choir? Often, I think I might be just about storied out. I feel like I've done almost all of my remembering finally and have told almost all of the stories from the old days, telling them to the new folks and sometimes the young folks who wander into this little green valley, beauty struck. I'm not sure why I tell the stories. They just come out of me as if from a little spring. And sometimes, doing so, I feel the faintest strand of something that might be a little like sadness, which is confusing indeed. For the stories are good ones, anecdotes of great drama, or again, beauty, or at least singular notice. The Yak has gone 50 years without a single acre of designated wilderness, the story might begin. Or a slightly different beginning. The Yak is the wildest, most diverse valley in the lower 48, home to grizzlies, wolverines, owls, eagles, ferns, otters. There are more stories about this place than there is time to tell them. It is a wellspring. It is me who falters, never this valley. Let me think of another way, a new way to begin this story. When I think of why the Yak matters, all the old reasons continue to wash past, more important now, I think, than they were when I first came into this valley nearly 30 years ago. The Yak is important to artists for its splendid duality. No one single perspective will adequately convey the Yak. In the Yak, as in art, A thing is often as composed of its oppositions and contradictions as it is of its core element, or the element first and most easily seen. The yak is important not just as ecological refugia for the emigres and exodus wrought by a burning West, but to our fragile little green souls, a place of refuge as all else goes away. The yak is important to us also as a dream. Not that it is not a substantial, physical, tactile reality in a world of too much else abstraction and ever-increasing homogeneity. It is one of the most specific places I've been. But the idea of a place like the yak, rank, fecund, unmanageable, mysterious, is vital to us as an idea, not just as a reality. For in so being, it makes a space for these things in our minds. The yak is important because of its fragrance. Due to its low elevation, high moisture content, and because of the yak's relative seclusion from wind in the bowl of it, and, always above all, its clamant vegetative diversity, scent molecules do amazing things in the yak, clinging to an abundance of well-aged, well-rounded, relatively undisturbed water molecules, binding to them in unique and astounding elixirs. Wet pine grass and sunstruck lupin, mid-morning in July, pipsissewa and bunchberry dogwood, cream-scented, mingling with the drier scent of paintbrush and the wet fur of a deer's belly from where it has just crashed through the sedgy marsh, that rich water spray vaporizing in the rising warmth of the day. You can smell the shade, the sheaves of cooler air displaced by the deer's crashing charge into that shade. Scent is stratified in the yak, denser and richer here than anywhere. The aroma of warming ponderosa pines soaking in the sun and exuding their vanilla vapors, even as the western red cedar exists paradoxically, contradictorily, anomalously, anomalous anywhere else but the yak, right next to those pea pines, just as the yew and aspen nestles in clumps within the stands of lodgepole or the Engelmann spruce and silver fir. None of these non-traditional forest associations make any sense, or rather make sense only in the yak. There is a different kind of democracy at work here. It is a democracy so profound that you can smell it. And again, the fragrance of it gets in your skin and in your clothes. When you get home at night from a long walk, it tumbles from your boots and socks. It is caught in flecks and chips in your hair. It is the scent of the forest and the underbrush, the scent of both specialization and bounty, and above all else, the scent of diversity. Often, extreme specialization will take place in the absence of ecological richness, in the harshest of conditions, while abundance or bounty may exist at the expense of specialization, residing in richer, more productive terrain. The yak is a super mix of the two, extremely rare niches and yet extreme productivity. It is a place, perhaps, of extreme moderation. There is simply no place like it in the world, and some days I still have trouble believing that not every square acre of it is protected forever and ever, but instead remains year after year and decade after decade, vulnerable and open to one endless battle after another, whether logging or mining or road building or dam making or subdivision planning or cell towering or any of the other of the new century's great hungers. Sometimes I feel like I am back in the shade of the alders, panting, looking out and reassessing after a sudden burst of flight, and wondering how much further, how much farther. The yak is important as a vessel, a reservoir for the world's sounds. The calls and intonations, the dialects of ravens are different here. Over the years, I've come to understand many of their calls based on subtle emphasis and timing. The single raspy grunt, the strident purr that sounds almost like alarm, save for the tenor of excitement and urgency in it in June, can mean one thing: lion kill, come check it out, I found it. While that almost same call in August can mean, fuck, it's hot. Whereas the slightest variation to that one lone call in September can mean, damn, it's good to be alive. Summer's behind us. It was a good one. I feel strong. It's good to be alive. Call it anthropomorphizing, as I suppose you must, But after you've lived here for 30 plus years and heard them talk, singly and in groups, day after day, out in the marsh or on the ridges playing, or back in the shady forest, or following you during hunting season, after all that, come back then and tell me it is anthropomorphizing. I've already been back and forth on all that, thinking, yes, it is anthropomorphizing, before finally coming to understand, no, it is not. They are ravens. They get to say and feel what they want, when they want, and that is why their calls vary ever so slightly at different times of years and under different conditions. There are communities of them up here. Their lives are not yet fragmented up there in the sky above the bowl of this valley. The yak should be protected because it's a place where ravens' calls are a little different. Really? Do you know how much wood we could cut if we decided to continue on at the old reckless pace? The mills are mostly gone now, but couldn't we cut anyway and make jobs somehow? How many jobs in that senseless frenzy? Almost as many jobs, perhaps, as could be gotten by putting back together or trying to stitch back together the damage wrought by the first wave of cutting from the 1930s to about the end of the 20th century, which is what the little nonprofit group I'm associated with, the Yak Valley Forest Council, has been doing for the last 20 years or so. Quietly raising dollars to pull old collapsed culverts, decommission weed-sprung, sagging logging roads, replanting savage clear cuts, inventorying stream quality. I predict that once 70 years of this have passed, the economy of restoration will have made as many jobs, will have brought as much revenue as did the old economy of devastation. So why not call it good then? Call it even, and listen to ravens. The scent of moss on a creek stone as the cold water rushes just barely over it, a few fibers of moss riffling so that you smell green moss and cold creek. The scent of bear grass up high, swirling with gusts of pine pollen, yellow streams of it mixing with the south winds of summer, and the scent of sunlight striking Pritchard quartzite, old beach sands that once sloshed back and forth in salty waves some 1 billion years ago. The yak is important because when big floods come scouring through, they scrub every rock, blast out the accumulated detritus of sediment that's washed in over the past year or so from building roads and logging upstream, finer grains that raise turbidity and water temperatures in ways not conducive or advantageous to the production of gleaming wild trout. And what mechanism exists, what pairing for the same scouring in our own tired and filled in and often cloudy or overheated minds? Surely beauty. Surely the green fire of beauty burns off or scours away that plaque. And it is here, in a garden like the yak, where such an experience can be had. The yak is important because each year tanagers show up at the marsh outside my cabin window between the 3rd and 8th of July. Because the snipe begin winnowing sometime between the 28th of April and the 1st of May. Because the long-toed salamanders begin creeping across the snow and ice fields, heading back to the vernal marshes that groan and crack and creak, breaking open like eggshells, hatching the open water once again, the buzzing dragonflies, the shimmering sedges, the heated breath of spring and summer and fall coming around again. I mean no blasphemy, but the yak is a kind of Bible. No one has ever lived here year-round, not even the first people, the Kootenai, a fish culture who lived along the Kootenai River and used the yak only for hunting. The stories we enact and experience here in the yak are first stories. Where else in the world does such responsibility exist? For 50 years, the yak has been ignored in wilderness designation, or worse, baited and switched, included now and again, and usually in limited representation. Ex-Senator John Melcher's Kootenai Lolo Accords was a bill constructed in part by agreements that had been reached between timber workers and environmentalists, a weak, even bad bill in that it would have released some roadless areas to logging, and actually passed Congress only to be vetoed by Ronald Reagan, who in theory should have been concerning himself with matters of international concern, but sought to damage Melcher in Melcher's upcoming Senate re-election. This was the same Ronald Reagan who supported the bipartisan wishes of Texans and protected tens of thousands of acres of wilderness in Texas, but none in the yak. Reagan's plan worked. Melcher lost, which ushered in 20 years of Conrad Burns, one of the staunchest anti-wilderness advocates in Montana's history. Later, Congressman Pat Williams passed a bill through the House that protected over 150,000 acres of yak wildlands, but the Senate killed the bill, led by Senator Burns. The yak is important, vital, for its paradoxes. It's one of the most unpeopled forested landscapes in the West. What is scarcest often has greatest value. The yak is important because of its incredible political history. I need not tell the choir how important this is in an era of polarization, gridlock, and the deathly toxification of the wilderness idea. Secretary of Agriculture Dan Glickman single-handedly stopped 128 miles of new taxpayer-subsidized road building into 6 of the yak's roadless areas in the 1990s due to then Representative Pat Williams contacting him and asking for help. In a place like the yak, and I believe that in this regard there may still be a few others like it out there, one person can still make a difference, and so can 3,000 school children, which is how many wrote Representative Williams, asking that the yak's roadless areas and most special wild places be spared. What is rare is often valuable. The yak is one of the most underrepresented landscapes in the National Wilderness Preservation System. Only the native prairie grasslands are more underrepresented than the interior low-elevation old-growth forest of the yak, which has been described as Montana's only rainforest. For this, the yak has always been an extraordinary jewel in the portfolio of our public lands. In the face of the warming world, the wild yak is even more golden, a pulse, a lobe or lung of sweet, cool, green, fresh, fur-scented air. All of us in the choir know the importance of the yak from an ecological perspective, though once upon a time that knowledge was not the case. Once upon a time, environmentalists who had never been to this off-the-beaten-path and hard-logged valley, in a strange no-man's land between Canada and Idaho, a strange blank spot west of Glacier and south of the Kootenays, a lovely black hole of a valley, looked at the maps of road building, 10,000 miles on the Kootenai National Forest alone, and thought, hard-logged, hence no wilderness. Back then, we couldn't abide even looking at clear cuts. We turned our backs from such testimony to greed, not the only element of the human condition, but often a key one, and said, the yak is not wild, and the yak is not wilderness. Except there were a few local folks who loved it, who knew it, and who loved the handful of grizzlies that still lived there, prospered there, few though they were in number, who loved the great gray owls, as unaffrighted by the approach of humans as might be penguins in the Galapagos. We've come a long way. Montana's senior senator, John Tester, has for several years now introduced his Forest Jobs and Recreation Act, a piece of legislation that would reward cooperation on difficult matters in 3 areas of national forest in Montana, including the yak. By supporting the common ground mapping exercises conducted by the general public, U.S. Forest Service, or the dysfunctional shell of it that still remains, and local timber, what few remain, and wilderness interest. House Republicans, who care nothing for the last few surviving mills, are blocking this bill yet again due to this year being a midterm election. Montana's sole representative in the House, Steve Daines, had pledged to try to work with the bill previously, but has instead just issued a statement to House Leader Boehner asking that the House not examine any place-based forestry or wilderness bills whatsoever this year. Here in the yak, we keep working. We are not waiting. We are working, as we have been for 50 years, and will for 50 more, 100 more, if we must. The individuals who have blocked our efforts thus far have been working against something, while we, though outnumbered and outspent, are working for something. That difference is all the difference in the world and in our lives. It is this difference that will one day bring us success. 50 years is a long time politically, and no work is ever wasted. Time just marches on. Thank you for your help.
Thoreau from Walking. How could we ever know with any exactitude his influence over time? We know how early he was, we know how courageous he was, and how precise he was. We can say, without knowing exactly, but we can mark down that in 1864, Congress passed, in a certain sense, the first conservation law ever, which was to transfer the Yosemite Valley to the state for a state park. And then in 1872, we established the world's first national park at Yellowstone. Walking was first presented by Thoreau in 1851, so that those two events were 13 and 21 years after he spoke. I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness as contrasted with a freedom and culture merely civil, to regard man as an inhabitant or a part and parcel of nature rather than a member of society. I wish to make an extreme statement, an emphatic one, for there are enough champions of civilization, the minister, the school committee, but every one of you will take care of them. The West of which I speak is but another name for the wild. And what I have been preparing to say is that in wildness is the preservation of the world. From the forest and the wilderness come the tonics and the barks which brace mankind. Our ancestors were savages. The story of Romulus and Remus being suckled by a wolf is not a meaningless fable. The founders of every state which has risen to eminence have drawn their nourishment and vigor from a similar wild source. It is because the children of the empire were not suckled by the wolf that they were conquered and displaced by the children of the northern forests who were. In literature, it is only the wild that attracts us. Dullness is but another word for tameness. It is the uncivilized, free and wild thinking in Hamlet and the Iliad, in all the scriptures and mythologies not learned in the schools, that delight us. As the wild duck is much more swift and beautiful than the tame, so is the wild mallard thought, which, mid falling dews, wings its way above the fens. A truly good book is something natural and as unexpectedly and unaccountably fair and perfect as a wild flower discovered on the prairies of the West or in the jungles of the East. In short, all good things are wild and free. There is something in a strain of music, whether produced by an instrument or by the human voice. Take the sound of a bugle on a summer night, for instance, which, by its wildness, to speak without satire, reminds me of the cries emitted by wild beasts in their native forests. Give me for my friends and neighbors wild men, not tame ones. The wildness of the savage is but a faint symbol of the awful ferity with which good men and lovers meet. break now, and why don't we come back faithfully in about 20 minutes at 5 minutes of 11. And we have refreshments next door. Oh, and Boulder Bookstore is now here in